And breaking news coming in on the international front when it comes to the talks between Russia and Ukraine. Now, after the failed talks in Istanbul between Russia and Ukraine, where Russia demanded the cessation of all land under control of Kiev, the US President Donald Trump had a 2-hour phone call with Vladimir Putin, the Russian president. Reports suggest Russia is ready to draft a memorandum with Ukraine, including ceasefire terms. Putin has made a statement saying the call with Trump was substantive, frank, and very useful. He also thanked Trump for supporting the resumption of direct talks between Moscow and Kiev. Listen in to what Putin had to say.
Сказать несколько слов о результатах нашего телефонного разговора с президентом Соединенных Штатов. Действительно, этот разговор состоялся, продолжался более 2 часов. Хочу отметить, что он был очень содержательным и весьма откровенным. И в целом, на мой взгляд, в этой связи весьма полезным. Прежде всего, я поблагодарил президента Соединенных Штатов за поддержку со стороны США возобновления прямых переговоров между Россией и Украиной по поводу возможного заключения мирного соглашения. По поводу возобновления переговоров, которые были прерваны украинской стороной, как известно, еще в 2022 году.
And I'm joined by my colleague Siddhant Mishra on the broadcast. So Siddhant, clearly Trump having a conversation that lasted over 2 hours, something that Trump really wants to hammer the point home that he really wants that ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, something he promised on the campaign trail. But you and I both discussed that major breakdown which happened in Istanbul between Russia and Ukraine after Russia made that startling demand of all the land under Kiev's control. But with this conversation between Putin and Trump, how much has the needle moved from that point?
Well, that's right, Ayushman. Actually, there have been efforts made in the past also after President Trump coming to power. But, there has never been a breakthrough as far as a war in Europe is concerned. In fact, as you rightly pointed out, last time around we discussed that how Putin proposed a meeting between the two sides in Istanbul. In fact, that meeting took place. There was no breakthrough. The maximum they could get was a prisoners exchange. And perhaps today also, if you look at the language that has been reported by some of the media houses, in fact, President Putin has called this call as substantive, frank, and very useful. So, indeed, there has been a frank conversation between President Trump and President Putin. But having said that, Ayushman, coming on the same page perhaps requires a mutual ground, and that mutual ground is something which both countries are not being able to achieve. And in fact, as you rightly said, Russia wants to keep the territory which Russia has gained in this war, and that is the biggest point of contention between the two sides. So, despite the efforts by America, Donald Trump has gone, to every limit, perhaps to make President Putin comfortable. In fact, he made United States vote in favor of Russia in United Nations. All those things have indeed happened. But, initially, President Putin did find President Trump in hurry, in desperation to get a ceasefire. Perhaps at that time he couldn't get. Then there was a threat which came from Secretary Rubio. He threatened both sides to be walking out, the U.S. to be walking out of the peace negotiations. Perhaps that also became a turning point where President Putin realized that he should also take an extra step, at least to sit with the Ukrainian delegation and talk. So as you rightly said, this conversation perhaps have taken place between the two sides. But again, the breakthrough is something which everyone is looking for right now. So unless the breakthrough is achieved, unless there is something substantial achieved, unless both countries come to a mutual understanding, nothing can be seen as a real progress. That is exactly how I look at this particular conversation. Otherwise, this would again be a routine effort being given by all sides to stay in touch. There have been a mediation in Riyadh where US and Russia sat down and perhaps discussed how to achieve peace. But then, each month, there is some or the other development.
Right.
But again, the breakthrough, the mutual ground is not being achieved. So again, there is an attempt by President Trump. In fact, President Putin has also to say that he proposed a talk with Ukraine. But Zelensky is also adamant that he's not going to compromise on the proposals on the demands that Russia has. So it looks very difficult that this war is going to end anytime soon.
Right. And Siddhant, very quickly, we're also getting an update where Trump has now also released a statement on the conversation he had with Putin, where he has said that Russia and Ukraine will immediately start negotiations towards a ceasefire and, more importantly, an end to the war, is the statement that's coming in from Donald Trump. So Donald Trump very confident about achieving a ceasefire between the two sides after the failure which took place in Istanbul. But clearly the Russian side will not budge from its entire stand that Ukraine has to cede the land that has been overtaken by Russia. And at the same time, for Donald Trump, even if Ukraine gives up a lot of its territory to the Russian Federation, if it leads to a ceasefire and the end of the war, Trump will chalk it up as a victory.
Well, absolutely. Look, we all know how President Trump functions. Perhaps he wants deal. He wants ceasefire. These are his favorite words. And he is in hurry. But, both the sides, Russia and Ukraine, are not understanding each other's demand. Perhaps they're not, ready to accept to what other side is demanding. So let's not go by what President Trump is saying, or is he looking confident, or is he sounding confident in the statements that have been released by his office? Because he was confident, Ayushman, ahead of him coming to power also, that I'm going to stop this war in a single day. He was also confident when he called Zelensky to White House. He was again confident when the talks started in Riyadh. He was again confident for the meeting in Istanbul, but nothing happened. So, it's just a desperation of President Trump. Perhaps, he needs to be more realistic at this point in time. And since already 4 months have passed, him becoming the president of the United States, I think it's a time for him to realize that what exactly is required. Simply issuing a statement, telling the other side will not be, solving the purpose. This will continue the same way. So I personally feel, in fact, that is my assessment, that this is again going to be a routine effort being made by both sides, nothing beyond that.
Right. Thank you, Siddhant, for joining us on the broadcast and getting us that piece of breaking news and all the developments which are coming in on that front. Trump very confident of achieving a ceasefire and the end of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but Putin not budging from his stand that Kiev needs to cede territory under its control to achieve a ceasefire. This was the point that was made by Vladimir Putin in that dialogue in Istanbul, and which was rejected by the United Kingdom, Poland, France, as well as other allies of the Ukrainian government. But at the same time, Trump, because he made this major promise during the elections that he will achieve a ceasefire and the end of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, he is hammering the point home, and any deal he would chalk that up as a victory for his administration. We will continue to track all the developments coming in on that front. For now, a quick break. More news and updates on the other side.